Hello and welcome to the last lesson of Unit 1, Topic 2, looking at waste products. Now we've looked at waste in terms of the digestive system, but we're now going to look at the actual excretory processes and getting rid of waste products in different ways from the body. So exchange of waste is looking at Pearson Biology section 5.2 from page 172. Now, there are three important goals for this lesson. The first is that you identify the different types of nitrogenous waste produced by the breakdown of proteins in the body. You also need to start looking at the urinary system, so explaining the function of each of the sections of the nephron, which is found in the kidney, and its function in the production of urine. So we're going to look at different parts of the nephron, such as the glomerulus, Bowman's capsule, the proximal and distal tubules, and the loop of Henle, and the collecting tubule. Lastly, you need to explain how glomerular filtration, selective reabsorption, and secretion across the nephron membrane contributes to waste removal. So we're looking at waste, but we're looking at waste that are produced as a result of the breakdown of proteins in the body, and then how our excretory system, namely our urinary system, gets rid of that waste. Now, in topic 1, we talked a lot about metabolism, the way that our body produces energy. And in those processes, we've talked about byproducts that form as part of those metabolic pathways. Some of those products are useful, such as producing water in aerobic respiration, and our body can use that byproduct, whereas other byproducts are harmful and need to be removed by the body. And that's the whole idea of the excretion process in the body. An example of a basic way that this happens is when our body produces carbon dioxide in cellular respiration. We don't need any big complex system to get rid of this because this occurs by exhaling that CO2 at the lungs. So the lungs assist in that excretion process by just simply removing that byproduct. There are other cycles that happen in the body as well, and one of the byproducts that we're going to look at are the toxic products that are produced when our body breaks down proteins, and we need to get rid of those byproducts, otherwise they'll build up in the body and we have issues that come about from that. So the removal of those metabolic wastes is called excretion. Now, in terms of the major excretory products within the human body, we've spoken about carbon dioxide, which is formed from cellular respiration, and we get rid of that by the respiratory system. Now, water can sometimes be considered an excretory product if we have excess amounts of it, and that can be from food and drink, and as I spoke about metabolism earlier. The body uses some, but we do need to excrete excess water in order to maintain normal salt concentrations and ion concentrations in the body, and that's done by the urinary system. Now, excess salts can be caused from a number of different things, and salts need to be maintained at the right levels in the body. Salts and ions have a lot to do with cell signaling, so it's important that salt levels are maintained, and again, this is generally done through the urinary system as well as some sweating. Now, the focus today is going to be these nitrogenous compounds, and these are formed from the breakdown of proteins and amino acids by the digestive system, which we spoke about in the last lesson. Remember, we spoke about the protease enzyme, which assists in breaking down proteins into peptides and amino acids. That's really useful because the body needs those amino acids, but unfortunately there are byproducts from that which we need to get rid of, and we're going to have a look at that today. Another excretory product are various chemicals, and that can be in the form of medications, any toxic substances like poisons, hormones. All of those things need to be excreted and maintained at normal levels within the bloodstream. A lot of that sort of stuff comes down to our liver and the way that our liver filters out those toxins and maintains normal levels. Over to the left here, this is having a look at those nitrogenous compounds again. Now, here we have our proteins being broken down into amino acids. And when we talk about nitrogenous waste, nitrogen is an element with the chemical symbol of N, and often that exists in an NH2 side chain. Now, that can be in the form of ammonia, urea, and uric acid. Now, generally in when we talk about ammonia, this is to do with marine organisms like fish. Us as humans, we produce urea, and that is the primary component of the urine. And other animals such as birds produce uric acid. They're all nitrogenous waste products, and it's really interesting if we start comparing across species, because we can see that over to the left here, there is a high need for water to excrete that waste product. And that's why we see ammonia on this end of the scale, because we're talking about marine things like fish. So the water assists them in excreting that product. Over here on the right with the uric acid, this is what is found in birds. And interestingly, birds excrete uric acid. Their pee and their poo is combined. And when we see bird poo, that's basically their uric acid as well. It's a solid object, so water isn't needed to assist in that process. However, going the other way, as we move from left to right, the energy needs to produce that excretory product is higher as we move from ammonia, urea to uric acid. Comparison across species is a really interesting point, particularly if you want to look at it from a research investigation perspective. Okay, so having a look at those nitrogenous waste products again. The image on the right is really just showing again what I spoke about with the different types of nitrogenous waste produced among different species. So the first of those is ammonia, which, as I said, is found in marine organisms such as fish. It's highly toxic, so often you'll find that if you have a fish tank at home, one of the major chemicals that's tested for in your testing kit is ammonia. If the levels of ammonia are high in the water, this suggests that the fish is excreting a lot of waste and that the water needs to be replaced to remove that waste product from the water. It doesn't matter so much in large bodies of water, but if we're keeping fish in small areas, the amount of ammonia needs to be monitored, as it's like swimming around in your own pee. The second waste product is urea. Urea is water soluble, and it's what we produce as our major product in our urine. Again, it's produced by protein breakdown, and we excrete that as well as other mammals, amphibians, sharks, and some fish. The last waste type with our nitrogenous waste is uric acid, which, as I said, includes birds. It does include some insects and snails, as well as other reptiles. Now, uric acid is produced as a solid waste. So in birds, it's kind of like their pee and their poo are combined into this solid waste product. Having a look at some other types of comparative excretion, if we look at really simple organisms like amoeba, which is this microscopic organism on the right here, diffusion of excretory products for the amoeba happens directly across the body surface. And this is much like what we've talked about with our simple diffusion, where because the organism is so simple, very thin layer, it can diffuse those products across its body. We also have a hydra here, which is another simple multicellular organism, and they excrete solid waste products by a mouth structure. Very simple organism, no particular excretory system, but this happens just by removal by the mouth. Now, us as higher multicellular organisms, as well as plants and animals, have well-defined excretory organs, and that varies in complexity depending on the organism. So we have a number of systems that assist in that, the urinary system, respiratory system, and this is the same among a lot of other multicellular organisms. We're going to start focusing just on human excretion for the moment. And in vertebrates such as humans, the main organ of excretion and water balance is the kidney. And we're going to spend a bit of time in this PowerPoint looking at the structures within the kidneys. Some other organs that assist are the skin, which we spoke about earlier, and that's because they contain sweat glands, and that can excrete urea, water, and salts in small amounts only. I mentioned the liver earlier, which is involved in excretion, and it's going to help with the breakdown of things like toxins. It helps with the breakdown of red blood cells and cholesterol, so fats and things like that. And I did mention the lungs as well, which are going to remove carbon dioxide through exhaling. Through the human excretory system, so basically the urinary system. So we're going to start with our kidneys. We have two kidneys, one on either side of the body, and they exist in our abdominal cavity and more towards the back of the body. Now, they are responsible for filtering all of our blood. You can see, if we think back to our previous lessons on the circulatory system, the kidneys are heavily linked to the circulatory system. Remember our major vessel, the aorta, that's going to be taking oxygenated blood from the heart into our kidneys, and they filter directly into the kidneys. Now, our kidneys receive that blood, and the entire volume of our blood passes through our kidneys every 5 minutes. So they are working hard all day filtering that blood. In the same way, the vena cava, the major vein which carries deoxygenated blood back to the heart, feeds out from the kidneys. So the major job of our kidneys is filtering that blood and producing urine, the waste product from our blood. And that urine travels through these structures here called the ureters. We'll have a look at the inside of the kidney a little bit later, but basically that ureter is going to collect all of the waste material and flow it down to be stored in the bladder. Now, the urinary bladder is just basically going to be storing that, and it's able to extend and fit quite a large amount of urine. And then the urethra is the final place where the urine is going to be expelled from the body. Okay, so taking a look at the inside of the kidney now. This is as if we would take a cross section through the kidney, and we're going to just have a look at some of the different parts so that this makes a little bit more sense. Now, remember before I spoke about the blood vessels that feed into the kidney. You can see here that they branch into these smaller parts called the renal artery and the renal vein. Whenever you hear renal, this is referring to the kidney. So this is the vein that branches off the aorta, carrying oxygenated blood, and the vein that travels back to the vena cava, carrying deoxygenated blood. So that nice blood comes in here to be filtered by the kidney constantly. That's the job of your kidney, doing it all the time. Now, around the outside edge of the kidney, we have these structures called renal pyramids. And within those renal pyramids are the very important structures called the nephrons. And we're going to have a look at this structure, the nephron, soon. The outside edge of the kidney is called the cortex, and they're really the key parts of this. The only other part here that's important as well is this renal pelvis. If you take a look at the structure of the nephron, we're going to actually find that as the blood filters in, it filters through the nephron, and as it's being filtered, the waste product is going to head into this renal pelvis. So all the waste comes down the bottom of those renal pyramids into the renal pelvis, and then that renal pelvis leads onto the ureter that I described earlier, which carries that urine down to be stored at the bladder. Now, there are a couple of videos that I'd like you to watch that allow you to visualize this a little bit better. So have a look at that on the PowerPoint yourselves. Okay, so having a look now at the structure of the nephron. So again, we've got the kidneys here. We zoom in on the kidney, and this is what we just went through before. So we've got our cortex around the outer edge. We've got our nephrons existing in those renal pyramids. The waste flows into our renal pelvis and out the ureter. So now let's have a look at that nephron structure. So we're looking in and zooming over here. Now remember, all of the blood needs to filter through the nephrons. So we have a branch off the renal artery. So remember, there's nephrons all around this kidney. So there's little branches of blood vessels going everywhere in here. So our renal artery is going to feed into the nephron. And we have this really coiled network of blood vessels called a glomerulus. And this is where the bulk of the filtration happens. The glomerulus is held within a structure called the Bowman's capsule. Now, the image zooms in on this structure here. So see how we've got this incoming arteriole. So that's basically an incoming blood supply, but really, really fine vessels. The blood comes in and it goes in amongst all of these little coiled structures of the glomerulus. and it gets pumped at high pressure through there, which allows the blood to be really well filtered. And then once it's done that, it goes out the outgoing arteriole. Now going back to our image over here, the outgoing arteriole leads into this section, which we call the proximal tubule. Proximal means close, so it's the first tubule. And the blood supply surrounds these tubules. And this is really important because we're going to see where some exchange of materials happens. So like we talked about with our diffusion and osmosis. Now the tubule continues, and the lower part down here is called the loop of Henle. And we're going to have a look at that as well in a minute. At the end, we have the distal tubule, and distal tubule means the tubule that's further away. The very last step is this collecting tubule, which is where all the waste is going to be collected. So we'll have a look at that now. Okay, so just showing you that nephron structure again. Incoming blood supply coming into that glomerulus region held within the Bowman's capsule. The distal tubule surrounded by blood supply, the loop of Henle, the proximal tubule, and then the collecting duct. Again, some really good videos here for you to watch to show you this a little bit better. So going through now in steps. I spoke before about how the glomerulus is under really high pressure and it's going to be doing a lot of filtration. Water, nutrients, and waste are going to be filtered in these capillaries, and the capillaries are going to be reabsorbing important things back into the cells of the body. Anything that's not useful from that, once it's gone through the glomerulus, are going to continue down to be further filtered in the later stages of the nephron. All right, so that first step is the glomerular filtration step. Now this step is looking at what happens in the proximal tubule, so the closer tubule. At this point, we have some active transport happening across this tubule. Remember, it's just like any normal membrane transport where there would be little channel proteins and carrier proteins within the membrane of this tubule. At this point, salts and nutrients will reabsorb back into the body, things that are useful that need to be kept by the body, and that needs some energy to do that. Also, at this point, we get water reabsorbing back into the body because we don't want to be urinating out large amounts of water unless we need to. Now, the loop of Henle is that low loop that we see at the bottom of the nephron. And this is where we see some interesting things with osmosis, active transport, and diffusion happening. Now, if we have a look at our tubule, we spoke in the last slide about how salts get reabsorbed at the proximal tubule. And that means that the tissue surrounding our loop of Henle is more salty than inside the tubule. And that's because of that active transport that happened in the last step. Because of those salty conditions, that's going to allow water to diffuse out of the loop of Henle and get reabsorbed back into the body. This is useful because we don't want to be removing water from the body or we would get highly dehydrated. So the last step absorbed the salt in so that would create a concentration gradient, high salt concentration outside the tubule so that water naturally leaves by osmosis to the more highly concentrated area. So it basically acts like a hypertonic solution. At the same time, we still get some more pumping of salt out of the cell, and some will diffuse out of the cell as well into the surrounding space. At the same time, urea that has been filtered is going to be entering the tubule to be removed by the body. Anything that's inside the tubule is going to get peed out. Now this leads us to the distal tubule, which is the furthest tubule of the ones that we've talked about, leading off the loop of Henle. Now we're going to be using active transport again here to move nutrients out of the urine, anything useful that needs to be kept in the body and not excreted by the urinary system. So again, we're getting salts, we're getting water, but at this stage as well, we're getting active transport taking in any drugs and other ions that need to be removed, waste products that need to be taken out. Now we're heading down into the collecting duct, which is where all of the waste, everything that hasn't been reabsorbed back into the body, is going to travel down to be excreted. So now we're entering the final stage at the collecting duct. And at this point, we're going to have more water leaving and being reabsorbed by the body because we don't want to remove more water than necessary. And again, that's because the outside of the tubule is so highly concentrated with salts. Finally, we're left with our urine, which is going to be collected, ready for removal by the body. Now, you're going to do some activities looking at that process of what's happening within the nephron. Hopefully from this, you're able to identify the different types of nitrogenous wastes, explain the function of each of the sections of the nephron and their functions, and explain how that glomerular filtration, the selective reabsorption, and the secretion across the nephron membrane contribute to the removal of waste. So that involves all those steps that I just talked through. It's really important that you have a look at those other YouTube videos to give you a more visual animation of what's actually happening at each step, and have a look in your textbook as well that goes over that. Have a look at the task once you've watched this, and have a go at completing the activities on your OneNote. Thanks, fellas.